In the summer of 1914, a single diplomatic choice made in a candlelit room in Berlin set into motion a cascade of events that would kill 17 million people, topple four empires, redraw the map of Europe, and birth ideologies that would dominate the rest of the century. This is the story of Germany's blank check. Europe in the early months of 1914 stood at the pinnacle of its power. Factories in the Ruhr Valley and Birmingham worked around the clock. Steamliners crossed the Atlantic in unprecedented luxury. Colonial empires stretched across continents, administered by men who believed civilization itself wore a European face. The great powers maintained an uneasy equilibrium through a complex web of treaties and alliances, each designed to deter aggression through the promise of overwhelming retaliation. Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy formed the Triple Alliance. France, Russia, and Britain countered with the Triple Entente. It was a system built on deterrence, and for decades it had worked. Crises flared in Morocco, in the Balkans, in the colonial periphery, but war between the great powers themselves remained unthinkable. Too costly, too catastrophic. The economies were too intertwined, the weapons too terrible, the consequences too clear. And then, on a bright June morning in Sarajevo, a 19-year-old tuberculosis patient named Gavrilo Princip fired 2 shots from a Browning pistol and changed everything. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, died along with his wife Sophie in the backseat of an open car on June 28, 1914. The news traveled by telegraph across Europe within hours. In capitals from London to St. Petersburg, officials read the dispatches with concern but not alarm. Political assassinations, while tragic, were not unprecedented. The Balkans had been a powder keg for years, erupting periodically in small wars and nationalist uprisings. Each time, the great powers had managed to contain the damage. There was no reason to believe this time would be different. But in Vienna, the mood was darker. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a sprawling, multi-ethnic anachronism, held together by dynastic loyalty and imperial bureaucracy in an age of rising nationalism. Serbs, Czechs, Poles, Hungarians, Croats, each group increasingly demanded autonomy or independence. The assassination wasn't just murder. It was a symbol of the empire's vulnerability. Franz Ferdinand had been killed by Bosnian Serbs with connections to Belgrade, and many in Vienna believed the Serbian government had been complicit. Count Leopold von Berchtold, the Austrian foreign minister, faced a choice: ignore the assassination and appear weak, inviting further challenges, or strike decisively against Serbia and risk a wider conflict. The critical question was Russia. If Austria moved against Serbia, would Russia intervene to protect its Slavic client state? And if Russia intervened, would Germany support Austria? The answer to that second question would determine everything. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm II was enjoying his summer routine. The German emperor was a complex, contradictory figure, at once bombastic and insecure, hungry for respect on the world stage, yet prone to impulsive decisions. His closest ally was Austria-Hungary, and he took the assassination as a personal affront. When Count Alexander Hoyos arrived from Vienna on July 5th, carrying a letter from Emperor Franz Joseph and verbal messages from Berchtold, Wilhelm received him at the new palace in Potsdam. They spoke over lunch. The conversation was informal, even casual. No stenographer recorded the exact words, but the message Wilhelm delivered was unequivocal. Germany would support Austria, whatever action Vienna chose to take, even if that action provoked Russian intervention, even if it meant war. It was called the blank check, an unconditional guarantee of support, no strings attached, no consultation with military advisors, no careful consideration of consequences. The German Chancellor, Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, confirmed the commitment the following day. Then Wilhelm departed for his annual summer cruise off the Norwegian coast, apparently satisfied that he'd strengthened his alliance and deterred Russian aggression through a show of resolve. The logic seemed sound. Russia had backed down before. In 1909, during the Bosnian crisis, St. Petersburg had threatened war, but ultimately accepted Austria's annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina when Germany stood firm. Wilhelm and his advisors believed history would repeat itself. A strong stance would force Russia to blink. The crisis would remain localized. Austria would punish Serbia, reassert its authority in the Balkans, and the great powers would avoid a general war that nobody actually wanted. But this time was different. Russia in 1914 was not Russia in 1909. After the humiliation of backing down 5 years earlier, the Tsar's government had modernized its military and strengthened its resolve. Russian leaders believed another retreat would destroy their credibility as a great power and potentially trigger revolution at home. And there was something else, something darker, lurking beneath the diplomatic calculations. Elements within the German military had concluded that war with Russia was inevitable and that Germany's strategic position would only worsen with time. Better to fight now, while Russia was still reorganizing, than in 3 or 4 years when the Tsar's armies would be fully modernized. The blank check wasn't just about supporting Austria. It was a gamble that if deterrence failed, the resulting war could be won. On July 23rd, Austria delivered an ultimatum to Serbia. 10 demands, carefully crafted to be unacceptable. Serbia had 48 hours to respond. The Serbian government, desperate to avoid war, accepted 9 of the 10 demands and offered to submit the final point to international arbitration. For any government seeking a peaceful resolution, it would have been enough. But Vienna had already decided on war. On July 28th, exactly 1 month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia and began shelling Belgrade. Now the mechanism activated. Russia, believing it could not abandon Serbia without catastrophic loss of prestige, ordered partial mobilization on July 29th. But partial mobilization proved impossible to execute. The railway timetables and military plans didn't allow for it. By July 30th, Russia moved to full mobilization. And full mobilization, in the logic of 1914 war planning, was tantamount to war itself. Mobilization meant calling up millions of reservists, commandeering railways, moving armies toward borders. It couldn't be done in secret, and once started, it couldn't be stopped without dismantling the entire military apparatus. Germany issued an ultimatum to Russia: halt mobilization within 12 hours. Russia refused. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. But Germany's war plan, the famous Schlieffen Plan, was predicated on a two-front war and demanded that Germany knock France out quickly before turning east to face Russia's slower mobilizing armies. This meant Germany had to attack France immediately, even though France had done nothing. And the fastest route to Paris ran through Belgium, a neutral country whose neutrality was guaranteed by treaty, including by Britain. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on France and demanded passage through Belgium. Belgium refused. German armies crossed the border. And on August 4th, Britain, bound by treaty to defend Belgian neutrality, declared war on Germany. In 6 weeks, a Balkan crisis had metastasized into a continental catastrophe. 5 great powers were at war, and more would follow. In Berlin, Bethmann Hollweg finally grasped what he had done. In a moment of anguished candor, he reportedly told his assistant, "If only we had never given that blank check." But it was far too late for regrets. The trains were moving. The armies were marching. The machine could not be stopped. All sides believed the war would be over by Christmas. German troops advanced through Belgium singing "Flowers in Their Rifle Barrels." In Paris and London, crowds cheered the declarations of war. The military staffs in every capital predicted quick victory. 6 weeks, perhaps 8 at most. Modern warfare? they assured their political leaders, was too destructive to last longer. They were catastrophically wrong. By September, the German advance had stalled at the Marne River, just outside Paris. Both sides tried to outflank each other in what became known as the Race to the Sea. By November, a continuous line of trenches stretched from the Swiss border to the English Channel. 400 miles of barbed wire, machine gun nests, and artillery positions. The Western Front had been born, and it would barely move for the next 4 years. What followed was industrialized slaughter on a scale humanity had never imagined. Poison gas turned lungs to liquid. Artillery barrages could be heard in London from France. At the Somme, the British suffered 60,000 casualties on the first day, many cut down in the first minutes of the attack. At Verdun, the French and Germans fed men into a killing machine for 10 months, losing 700,000 between them for a few miles of cratered mud. The war spread beyond Europe. The Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers. Italy switched sides and joined the Allies. Japan seized German possessions in Asia. Eventually, unrestricted submarine warfare brought the United States into the conflict, tipping the balance decisively. By November 1918, when the guns finally fell silent, 17 million people were dead and 20 million more wounded. Entire villages had lost every man of fighting age. A generation of European youth lay buried in mass graves across France and Belgium. But the human cost, staggering as it was, represented only part of the catastrophe. 4 great empires had collapsed. The German Empire dissolved in revolution, Kaiser Wilhelm fleeing to exile in Holland. The Austro-Hungarian Empire splintered into a half-dozen successor states. The Russian Empire drowned in the Bolshevik Revolution, emerging as the Soviet Union after a brutal civil war. The Ottoman Empire was partitioned, its Middle Eastern territories carved up by British and French mandates, borders drawn with rulers on maps that ignored ethnic and religious realities. The world of 1914, dominated by monarchies and empires, was gone. What replaced it was uncertain, unstable, and seething with resentment. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, placed sole blame for the war on Germany and its allies. The blank check decision of July 1914 became Exhibit A in the case for German war guilt. The treaty imposed crushing reparations, stripped Germany of territory, and limited its military to a token force. It was designed to prevent Germany from ever threatening Europe again. Instead, it created the conditions for an even more devastating conflict 2 decades later. The economic devastation and national humiliation of Versailles poisoned German politics. A failed Austrian painter named Adolf Hitler, himself a veteran of the trenches, built a political movement on the promise of overturning the treaty and restoring German greatness. The blank check of 1914 had led to the trenches. The trenches had led to Versailles, and Versailles would lead to Auschwitz and Hiroshima. But the consequences rippled even further. The war had shattered the old diplomatic order, replacing balance of power politics with ideological conflict. Fascism emerged from the trenches in Italy. Communism, strengthened by the Russian Revolution, spread across Eurasia. The United States, reluctantly drawn into European affairs, would eventually find itself leading a new alliance system in the Cold War. European colonial empires, weakened by the war, would spend the next half-century collapsing, reshaping Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. The borders drawn in the peace treaties, particularly in the Middle East, continue to generate conflict today. Could it have been different if Germany had refused to give Austria the blank check or had attached strict conditions, demanding Austria accept Serbia's response to the ultimatum, for instance? Would the cascade have been prevented? Perhaps Austria, unsure of German support, would have backed down. Perhaps the crisis would have remained a Balkan affair, or perhaps the underlying tensions would simply have erupted later in some other form. We cannot know, But what we do know is that the blank check narrowed the range of possible futures, making the catastrophic outcome far more likely. The men who made the decision in July 1914 were not uniquely evil or stupid. They were products of their time, trained in a diplomatic culture that valued resolve and feared the appearance of weakness. They believed in the alliance system that was supposed to preserve peace through deterrence. They could not imagine, or refuse to imagine, that their promise of unconditional support would transform a manageable crisis into an uncontrollable catastrophe. They thought they were preventing war. Instead, they guaranteed it. On that summer afternoon in Potsdam, over lunch in a room filled with sunlight, Kaiser Wilhelm gave his promise. Austria could count on Germany. No conditions, no reservations. It seemed like an act of loyal friendship between allies. It seemed prudent, even wise, a show of strength to deter Russian aggression. But that promise became a fuse, and once lit, it burned faster than anyone anticipated. By the time German leaders understood their mistake, by the time Bethmann Hollweg whispered his regrets, millions were already marching toward the trenches. The blank check changed the 20th century, not because it was uniquely wicked, but because it was carelessly optimistic. It assumed the best, that adversaries would back down, that systems would function as designed, that catastrophe could be controlled. Instead, it unleashed forces that consumed everything. The empires fell, the ideologies rose, the wars continued, each a consequence of the last. Everything that followed, the Holocaust, the Gulag, the atomic bomb, the Cold War, emerged from the world the Great War created. And the Great War emerged from a promise made too easily, in a room in Potsdam on a summer day in 1914. One decision, one consequence, one century change.